So AI is what we can't do yet. As soon as we can do it, we call it machine learning or expert systems. It's just, it's a ridiculous thing. It's basically AI is all the things we want to do, and machine learning and expert systems and all that kind of stuff are things that we can do. So as soon as we do it, it's no longer AI, it's something else. And so AI is always going to be receding in front of us. But yeah, anybody would call Siri or Alexa AI 50 years ago. But now it's just something else.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello, I'm Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. My guest this week is Kevin Kelly. Kevin, I think, may be the smartest person in the world, and I'm only half joking when I say this, and I can't, of course, verify it, but I've been deeply interested in his work, and his thinking has profoundly influenced mine. His 2010 book, What Technology Wants, changed my perspective on information technology, of which I've been involved with for over 20 years. His book, Cool Tools, is a compendium of the best tools cultivated from his years of research and leveraging the power of crowds, and it's a fascinating book. His blog post, 1,000 True Fans, has been an entrepreneur's favorite for years on the web since he published it in 2008, and I highly encourage you to go read it, whether you're an entrepreneur, an artist, or whether you just want to somehow find a way to get your work out into the world. His latest book, just released this summer, is titled The Inevitable: Understanding the 12 Technological Forces That Will Shape the Future. And his podcast interviews on some of the best podcasts on the planet, London Real, Tim Ferriss, Lewis Howes, and Chase Jarvis, are fantastic to listen to. So I asked him to come onto the show to get into topics I'd not heard him dive into before, get a fresh perspective that I was curious about, and I know you will too. And I might add that what I've just mentioned is only a fraction of the items that Kevin is involved with. So on my show notes, I'll link out to ways for you to learn more about Kevin and getting into some of the interesting projects and other books and other material that he's published. Some of the major takeaways from this episode that I want you to learn about is that if you were the leader of a 1,000-person company, what would you ask your direct 5 reports to do? And I asked him this question because I was really interested in his perspective of the planet and of the world and of the technology trends. How would he direct a company to respond to this? And then what skills are needed to teach kids to handle this new future in regards to learning and also in regards to failure? And we also got into ethics and governance and his perspective on artificial intelligence as it relates to these topics. And also his thoughts on how humans, our ethics and our morals will be impacted by AI. Kevin's philosophy on AI is very unique, but it's massively important to understand his approach because I think it's the right one. We also reviewed IT security from his perspective as a biological system embedded into the internet. So those of you interested in enterprise IT security will really find that interesting. And his opinion about AI and machine learning and deep learning, and he also calls that expert systems. But what are the differences? People are throwing these marketing words around, but he has a very important distinction between them that I found very refreshing. And the importance of being a newbie and the attitude of being a lifelong learner in the age of which innovation and change is very, very rapid. There's no static learning. We have to have a newbie attitude. And he has an interesting take on this. And the difference between learning how versus how you learn. So learning something is different than having a really deep appreciation for your unique way of learning. And he thinks that's important. So we talk about that. Also for enterprise leaders, how do you fail? What's the best way to fail within an enterprise? And the importance of looking at the edges, especially for leadership, looking at the edges for opportunities. I also brought up a quote that he'd written in one of his books. It was, "In a world of abundance, the only scarcity will be our attention." In a world of abundance, the only scarcity will be our attention, by Herbert Simon. And so I asked him about that. He had an interesting response to how we're going to manage our attention in the future. So you'll find links to all Kevin's work, including his recent book on redzonetech.net/podcasts. Thank you for listening, everybody. Now on with the show, and I want to welcome you to my fun discussion with Kevin Kelly. Well, Kevin, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Well, it's a real delight to be here. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to spend a couple minutes just exploring a couple of the concepts that you covered in your new book, and also it was really interesting. I've been an avid reader of not only your blog, but also your book, Cool Tools, and your book, What Technology Wants. And I've been tracking this for a couple of years now, just kind of digesting your thinking. And one of the interesting pieces I pulled from your book, the What Technology Wants, was interesting because your book that you just released called Inevitable, the Understanding the 12 Technological Forces That Will Shape Our Future. So that was the title, which we're certainly going to talk about. But one of the pages from your book actually, I think, was interesting because it teed up this conversation. It said, scientists and inventors are repulsed that progress in technology is inevitable. And it was really interesting. It was serendipitous that I pulled the book out at this point. And I put in quotes, it was a cop-out that you mentioned it. People think it's a cop-out or a surrender to non-human invisible forces. So how are people, and what are your thoughts to how people are reacting to the word inevitable?
Some people get upset and other people are worried about it in the sense that, they can accept that there are certain things that are inevitable, but they're not happy with what seems to be becoming inevitable. And so they would prefer otherwise. And there are those who just object to it and, kind of want to refuse to believe that anything is inevitable. So there's kind of people who don't like it but accept it, and there's others who won't even accept it. And then there's others who I think hopefully I can convince them, which is saying that, you have to accept it, but we have far more degrees of freedom and far more freedom in it. We have plenty of choice, and that in fact a lot of what we care about is not the inevitable part, but what version of things that we get, and that we have enough choice there to keep us busy and to focus our efforts. So it's like the telephone was inevitable, but what kind of telephones we get is up to us. And same thing with tracking or AI. Those are inevitable, but we actually have a lot of choice in the ways in which those forms come to us, whether they're open or closed, commercial, non-commercial, international, parochial. We have a tremendous amount of choice, even though the larger forms are inevitable. That choice shapes what we think about them and gives us plenty of opportunity to exert our will.
What I find most interesting about the word inevitable and reading through the chapters is that I feel like the human brain almost has to be upgraded as you read it, almost to be able to think about the incomprehensible or think about the future in the way you do this continuously. But for a leader to look at this, for someone to really engage with this thinking, do you feel that there has to be a different, almost like a radical way of using your own brain?
Yeah, I've never thought about that. It's possible. A great example of it's like if you look at demographic trends, they're inevitable on a certain time scale, meaning that, there's not much we're going to be able to do to change the next 20 years in terms of the number of people on the planet. And so you have to accept that at a certain level and then work with it. So maybe that brain thing it's kind of like a lot of what a lot of leadership is about is you kind of accept the things that you can't change and then you focus on the things that you can. It's like that old St. Francis prayer, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for sure.
And looking for wisdom to be able to tell the difference between the two. So leaders have to you have to accept certain things, and you have to, you try your hardest, but at a certain point you realize that there are certain things and you have to be realistic about them. You can't just deny them. And then, but once you accept things, then you can hunt for or find the levers that you do have control over. And I think that's sort of what I'm talking about in technology is the same way, but there may be more of technology that is inevitable than we first thought.
And maybe one of the pieces is that I think maybe the brain or the way we think about some of these inevitable, picking on AI, for example, is we're looking at it as a natural threat because of more of our inclined wiring. But what I found was really interesting listening to you at the RSA conference is that you talked about really the ethics, like possibly this is a great way to really get our own ethics and our own governance in order as we programmatically set up AI. Maybe can you comment a little bit to what your thoughts are about that?
Yeah, I mean, my basic assumption, default premise is that humanity is something that we have invented over time, that we're self-created, and we are ongoing in it. We are still creating it, and there are even our morality and our laws and ethics are basically something that we've been working on and are creating over time. And that we're still in a very primitive stage of that, and we think of ourselves as highly evolved ethically, but actually I think we're fairly shallow, and we don't have a very deep or consistent articulation of it. And we can teach and need to teach our AIs morality and ethics because they're making decisions, and sometimes these are life and death decisions, like if you're driving a car or making a decision in a medical, or if we have them be drones or soldiers. These are important decisions, and we have to give them kind of the ethical morality bearings that we have. And we can do that if we were very clear about what ours were. And it turns out that when we sit down to try and convey this in a program, we realize that our own ethics and morality are very, very shallow and inconsistent and not very well developed. And as we try and teach, it's like teaching our children, we realize we're not very good, and the process of teaching actually is making us better because it's forcing us to go another level deeper. It's forcing us to be even clearer. It's forcing us to go wider and become more consistent. So over time, as we try to develop the ethical systems of the AIs and robots, we ourselves will become better. We will be able to teach ourselves better. We'll be able to be more aware of it. We'll be more articulate. We'll be actually better ethically as we try to teach these mind children how to do it.
Yeah, I had an interesting, I think it spurred from the conversation, again, at this conference I had at the dinner table with my own kids, and they're not technically inclined at the moment, and they were saying, oh, Dad, we're never going to get involved in artificial intelligence, and I explained the driverless cars and how if driverless car sees a human being in the road in front of them, and it's programmed to swerve away from the human being, but then on the sidewalk there's 3 human beings, who's going to make that decision? And it was trying to make it clear that the programming ethics and the philosophy around the debate is probably going to be as equally as important as the technology itself.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, we give our humans a pass. We don't require us to actually to make those decisions. We just say, oh, it's up to the moment. We didn't have time to think. We're not responsible. But the AIs kind of work in slow motion in a sense, and we have to actually give them a decision because they will think through all that. And so we won't give them a pass. We can't give them a pass. And therefore, in some senses, they're going to be more ethically than us because we give ourselves a good excuse to not have to think about these things.
So I'd love to ask you a couple questions about the rising complexity. So this is really built upon your previous book. You had mentioned in 2010 that you thought, I forget the exact statistics, but the world of connected devices, that the Earth was connected with both routing and switching and servers and such, and the Internet of Things was roughly the order of magnitude of one human brain of complexity. And I wanted to ask you, where do you feel the complexity of the connected world is right now in relation to that?
Well, it's actually, I did revisit those numbers. It's many orders of magnitude greater than a human brain. It's multiple brains. And there was I think it was 2029, 2030 or something, when the complexity of all the machines connected would equal the complexity of all the humans connected, all the human neurons. In other words, if you took 7 or 10 billion humans and you added all those neurons and you have this sort of global brain of all the human neurons, we'd also have a similar number of transistors connected as neurons. And something's going to happen when that happens. I don't know what, but that's, you cannot connect a gazillion transistors together and not have something happen.
Well, I find that your chapter on filtering was interesting because as the complexity rises, and this is impacting for business decision makers, IT security, it's beyond the human beings from being able to help. We're going to need some help from either AIs that we program, or which I guess would translate into machine learning. But at some point, we're going to need some help because you even quoted Herbert Simon, the social science, who won the Nobel Prize, a social scientist. You said, in a world of abundance, the only scarcity is our attention. And I'm just curious, how do we get attention in that much complexity?
Yeah, well, and this is slightly scary, but the answer is that there will be lots of stuff happening that will not have our attention or understanding. I think the thing we still don't really appreciate is the extent to which a lot of AI will be happening, and we simply will be inherently unable to understand what it's doing and its decisions. There is one hope of a technological solution to this, which is that in a certain sense there might be types, or I should say subsets of AI whose role is to reveal the thinking processes of another AI. In a certain sense, we could think of our own self-consciousness as that. We make decisions and stuff that could be opaque to us, but we have this other system that we try to use to access how we think. And it's actually kind of a separate process. And so we might put into AIs more of this self-consciousness in order to help us figure out what it is, how they made a decision. So the problem with an AI is that it could make a decision that, say, was prejudiced, and we wouldn't even know it. It might not even know it. It wouldn't know it. And we would have difficulty even determining that. But we probably will start to layer in these other forms of consciousness in order to help us access the thought process. Because right now the way it works is that we don't have any access to it, and it's not aware of it. And so it's becoming more and more complex, and we don't know how it arrives. So there's like a famous mathematical proof that has like 1 million steps in it. And there's just simply no human that can hold that in their brain. So we have to accept the mathematical proof, the computer proof, as either valid or not. You have to we can verify each step, but we can't take the whole thing as a whole. So there might be AIs that we develop whose whole job is simply to help us ascertain or probe other AI decisions, say. You could think of that as kind of a consciousness or self-consciousness. So I think this is a huge area that we're going into, which is that we will have difficulty accessing. And if we get to the planetary scale of all these things, there'll be difficulties we have just of the scale at which these things are happening. And so we might be able to develop tools that would allow us to get some better understanding of what's happening, because I think without them, we have no hope.
You used the example of Amazon and in many within that chapter, but maybe you have Amazon is able to select based on preferences or based on your previous selections, but maybe there's an AI that gets programmed as like a personal assistant of some sort, or that you could kind of upload higher orders of thinking or more complex thinking to. Is that sort of what you're thinking?
Yeah, so we're running these very large systems on a kind of planetary scale right now. I mean, I think one of the things we're going to import into, say, the internet and trunk lines and servers is this idea of immunology, that you have an immune system, and that the way you deal with malware or hacker or break-ins and other kinds of stuff is that you have an immune system which is working as not any local, it's not being run on sort of like a local server, it's being run in the system itself. And there's kind of global cooperation necessary to run these things that can ascertain whether there's a foreign body and have a memory about foreign bodies and work in a way to eradicate or keep it to a minimum. You can't ever, and that's the immunology thing, is nothing gets to zero. You can have a presence that you tolerate at a certain level, and you keep it there. And so there's a kind of a biological model for dealing with these things. And then intellectually, or intelligence is another thing too, which is it's learning, it's adapting. We may not understand it, but we might have these modules or this another layer that would try to monitor, self-monitor, and that's sort of the equivalent of the self-consciousness. And so I think a lot of this is happening not so much at the consumer level, but at a higher infrastructure level. There will be consumer-facing AIs like your Amazon Echo, Alexa, where you're having a conversation with it. Maybe they could represent you. You can have an agent that's only working for you. But a lot of this is happening at a systems level.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny you brought up this point about the immunology and a sort of like human body equivalent of when we have an infection, the human body just automatically deploys to the site of the infection and hopes to heal. And and I watched you give a YouTube presentation on this. I couldn't find it. I'd listened to it about a year ago. I couldn't find it subsequently, but it stuck in my brain because I brought someone on the podcast about 9 months ago who talked about STIX and TAXI, which is really information sharing protocol between the federal government. So we get calls, our teams from the FBI, letting us know that XYZ customer currently has an exotic attack going on, which they don't even know about because it's a 0 day. And we sit here going, well, why didn't the FBI just share that information? Well, there are methods of trying to get the federal government to share with commercial, because commercial sort of already has a lightweight sharing going on between some of the Silicon Valley companies that are like Palo Alto and some, but it's a lightweight sharing. They're not sharing all signatures. But I can imagine, as even one of your chapters is on sharing, is that this ultimately will be shared so that federal government data, commercial data, like the top heavyweights like Palo Alto and Cisco and such, are all sort of enmeshed. But then that's being ingested back into the firewalls and the antivirus signatures so that it's a symbiotic deployment. So when there's a DDoS attack somewhere, then we can automatically deploy signatures to mitigate. So it's a very interesting
Absolutely.
thing.
I mean, to me, that's inevitable. I mean, I would say that, any sophisticated, global civilization would have one of these things operating. There's political challenges that stand in the way, but technically, I think enough is known about how to do this today that it could be accomplished with some, additional innovations in management tools and safeguards and stuff like that. But I think it has to be much more of a algorithmic self-learning system to manage these things. And it does require global cooperation because you can't, you basically, it has to work everywhere or it doesn't really work. And so I think the biological models, the learning models, and then there'll be a layer of AI in this, which will be essential. And maybe that's the main tool that we're waiting for is to have this intelligence that can recognize a new signature for what it is, or in some ways have a protocol for what needs to be done so that you're not having humans involved, humans who are awake or not awake, waiting to act. You have something always on. You have the Alexa, which is always on.
Yeah, right, in the background. So you distinguish between a AI and machine learning. Is machine learning more is basically a more commercially ready than it? Like, how would you?
Yes.
It is.
So AI is what we can't do yet. As soon as we can do it, we call it machine learning or expert systems. It's just, it's a ridiculous thing. It's basically AI is all the things that we want to do, and machine learning and expert systems and all that kind of stuff are things that we can do. So as soon as we do it, it's no longer AI, it's something else. And so AI is always going to be receding in front of us. But yeah, anybody would call Siri or Alexa AI 50 years ago. But now it's just something else.
And that's one of the big parts of your book that you talked about is the differentiation between the now versus the future. You were talking about, I think this is one of the pieces that makes people very uncomfortable, is they're constant newbies because of the speed at which change is happening with the technology. Or maybe you can try better for you to explain what you meant by we're constantly being newbies in the now.
So no surprise to anybody at all that we have this accelerated change, which I think will continue despite the fact that most of the technology in our lives, if we look at it kind of quantitatively, most of the technology in our lives is old stuff. It's stuff that was invented before you were born. It's wiring, switches, electrical, plumbing systems, roads, concrete. That's most of the stuff. And So we tend to view technology as anything that was invented after we were born, but it's actually everything that was invented before we were born and after we were born. And the stuff that was invented after we were born, the new stuff often doesn't work very well either. It takes a while for it to kind of figure out what it does and what its best role is and how it works. So we have a real focus on this kind of current stuff, but most of what surrounds us is old. However, the new stuff preoccupies us, and that will continue to keep changing very, very fast. And in order to use it, we have to keep learning it. And we think we've mastered the phone, but the phone is going to be replaced by something else, VR or something else coming. We'll have to learn another set of gestures, another set of interface cues, another set of programming languages, whatever it is. And so there's no rest, basically, from this river of new things coming. And this proper stance, really, is to understand that we will forever be newbies, the clueless newbie who has no idea what things mean, who doesn't understand the slang or the jargon, who is a little bit embarrassed because there's people around who seem to be very fluent in it. But that's just going to be the state for everybody. You can't be experts in everything, and the new things coming along will have no experts, and so we'll all be kind of slack-jawed, clueless people, and that's okay. That's to serve the standard default position. And if we kind of accept that, then we can, go through the process of learning yet another thing. And so that's, we shouldn't think, well, I can coast now because I know how to use a laptop. I know how to use a phone. It's like I am, I'm set. No, you're not set, because in 5 years, there's going to be a whole nother regime, and you're going to have to learn all this new stuff again.
So we almost have to be in a continual state of learning, almost a perpetual learning in many respects. There's no...
Right. Yeah, they talk about lifelong learning. Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. And in many ways, your learning begins when you graduate. And it's, but I do think that there are some general skills, I call them techno-literacies. There are general skills about how technology in general works that are very useful and can persist over time. Just basic notions that, first of all, that you will be a newbie, and that every new thing you take into your life has not just a monetary cost, but has a maintenance cost as well. So you start to want to be more selective, and you can't use everything. There are too many choices, so you have to start. We're curating, so to speak, the technologies. Since we can't use all of them, we have to actually select certain ones. So there's going to be meta skills in terms of selecting which technologies we want to keep, which ones we want to maintain, because they all need maintenance, etc. So I think there are kind of uber technological skills that are helpful to have, but they're not specific to a particular kind of technology.
Well, I think you sort of hit on that a little bit, because there's too much information. You got to have that skill of selecting.
Yeah.
If you owned a company, let's say had 1,000 employees, and you had a team of 5 business leaders, what would you say to them as far as how you would want them learning, and how you would want them understanding these shifting that's going on, so that the company remained competitive? And maybe focus on the business side, the business IT leadership and the business marketing leadership. How would you want them to think about the future?
It's a really good question, and of course very, very practical. I like what Mark Andreessen has often said, where they like to pay attention to, which is, what are all these thousands of people doing on their day off and their free time? Because I like to look where technology is misused, abused, and unsupervised, which is basically how the criminals, the kids, and this, children in the street uses it. Because I think there you kind of get a little bit more sense of where it wants to go, what it wants in a certain sense, because it's not really being dictated by what people should be doing, what they believe is supposed to be doing, but actually it's been released a little bit to go its natural way. And in that sense, also I call follow the free, look where people are using it for free to see, before monetization, without monetization, which would give you a little bit better idea of where things are going. So I recommend that they pay attention to and try to what I call listen to the technology to see where it wants to go, what these ingrained tendencies are, For instance, for 30 years, the music and Hollywood industries have refused to pay attention to the fact that things want to be copied. Inherently, you can't stop copies from flowing. And so there's been this misplaced emphasis from them on copy protection, copy laws, and blah, blah, blah. They've lost 3 decades of their own advancement by refusing to understand or acknowledge or accept the fact that they can't stop copies from flowing around. And this was evident 30 years ago very clearly to most people online, which is that this technology wants to copy stuff, and so you can't stop the flow of copies. And so I think there's similar things happening now from tracking and AI, the kind of stuff that we're talking about, that some people will just not see, or having seen, refuse to accept, and will try and prohibit or block or stop or turn down or turn away or whatever. And I'm preaching something different, like look at the edges, because that's where the center is going to go, and listen to what is happening in these places where it's unsupervised or where it's happening before monetization, because that's going to give you a much better idea of where the main thing is going to be happening. And so look at the margins, because that's where the center is going to go.
So edges in the margins, so you'd basically tell them to look there and where it's unsupervised before monetization.
Right. So if I was in the IT, it was just like, what are people doing with all this kind of stuff on weekends? What are the bad guys doing with this? Where do kids give their attention? Pokemon.
Sure, absolutely.
It's like Pokemon is like the future, and not the game itself. It's not the game. That's not going to last very long. But that thing that's happening, this convergence, this mixed reality, that's big.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect, and then that's one of the questions I'd asked earlier, was about almost the neuroscience and the brain and the thinking, is like, what are the best questions to ask? So that's a great answer. I appreciate that. I think the audience is going to love that piece. And then I was curious also from a kid's point of view, because I have 3 kids like you do. Mine are way younger, but what kind of skills do you think that kids should, or parents should really be encouraging their kids to have as they grow up, to be able to be in the best position to take advantage, add value, and see these edges for themselves?
Yeah, well, I think if you want an answer, you ask a machine in the future. I mean, the answers are going to come from machines. So the one skill is you want, I think, to train kids to ask really great questions. And there's all different kinds of great questions, but that's questioning, exploration, which exploration is a type of questioning, innovation is a type of questions. What if this, what happens if that, what if I do that? These are all kinds of questions. So I think questioning is a good question is much better than knowing an answer. I think the other kinds of skills are, and by the way, questioning authority, which is the sub-theme of every American Hollywood movie, the rebel who questions authority.
Sure.
That's still very, very valuable. It's questioning assumptions. I mean, but you have to do it, and there's a certain way of doing it, because most assumptions actually are true, right? The things everybody knows, most of those are true,
Sure.
But there's some that aren't. And so there is I don't know, what's a kind of a graceful questioning of authority, maybe, questioning what everybody knows, but you have to be realistic about it, because a lot of what everybody knows is true. London really is the capital of England, okay? So, but I do think this idea of being able to challenge in a graceful way and question things is a huge thing for innovation, for discovery, for creation. But technologically, I think being a newbie, lifelong learning, and then the other thing that's an essential element that other cultures have a little bit more difficulty doing, which is this idea of failing forward, of using failure as a mode of learning, of trying to keep failures fast and small rather than big and traumatic. So it's sort of like what I would call failure management, learning how to fail usefully and productively.
It's not a stigma to fail, but actually, as you do it, you can do it fast and quick as an experiment versus a stigma.
Exactly, right. It's a tool. failure as a tool, as a means of learning, as a method of progress. And so and particularly for overachieving kids, that's a big thing to master failure, because a lot of them haven't experienced failure in that way. And so, I mean, sometimes it will hurt. It's like sports, you're going to trip and fall. It's going to hurt, but that's just sort of part of it. And so I think other kinds of skills besides learning how to learn, which is to me the uber skill, and it will actually have something to say about that. It's not just learning how to learn. You can kind of imagine that, but here's the real trick. And I learned this from Tim Ferriss. It's learning how you learn. We all learn differently, and what you actually want to be able to do is to understand how you learn best, so that while you're learning all your life, you're doing it because you have figured out how you learn best. And so that varies tremendously between people. And so coming to that is pretty challenging, but that's the thing that you want to know, because we all learn differently. Of course, we learn different things differently as well, so it's a very complex answer. If you can get there early, let me put it that way, you're way ahead.
Well, that's a great message. I love that, and I appreciate you for spending some time answering that, because I think that a big part of this is going to be learning and being open to learning, and training kids is different than adults learning new skills, which is interesting because one of the pieces about, you had mentioned about one of the, I think it was quantification section of your book, and I wanted to pick on quantified self, because I know you're really deeply involved in the quantified self movement. I think you might have even invented the word, but I'm not sure exactly. Did you?
The word came out of a conversation that Gary Wolf and I, the founders of Quantified Self, had on a walk where we were kind of inventing the movement. I think he first suggested the term, and we both immediately acknowledged that it was the right thing, and we started to spread it. So I think the credit probably goes to Gary, but we both tried to foster it by naming this little meetup originally called the Quantified Self, posting it on the internet saying, if you're quantifying yourself, or you think you are, come to the first Quantified Self meetup. And we just wanted to see who would show up. And from that, actually, coincidentally, Tim Ferriss showed up on that very first meeting. And he was doing things that were way beyond anything we imagined anybody was doing at the time. And from that, there's been many thousands of meetups later around the world, people doing a show and tell, telling about how they are self-tracking and developing the new tools and the new technologies and the protocols and the philosophy around that. And so I don't attend as frequently as I used to. Gary's kind of running the organization, but I do try to keep up with what's happening, and I can say pretty confidently that anything you can possibly imagine that's quantifiable, somebody in the world today is tracking it.
Yeah, that was a fascinating chapter, Kevin. And I have a short story to tell you about it. I was actually had a concern about my health, and I went to a doctor. She really didn't know what to do with blood tests and urine specimens and all of this. So I went to another doctor who then prescribed, he basically sent out the results, and he said, I don't know why you're here. You're young, you're in your 40s, but we'll send them out anyway. So he sent them back, and there was truly there was a bunch of problems that he didn't know how to solve. So I had to go find yet another doctor to figure out how to solve them, which did. But what was interesting is that then I was training for an Ironman, and I had on my watch my heart rate, and then I had my power outage on the machine, on the bike, talking to me. And finally, halfway through the Ironman, I was like, all this data was coming at me. I said, you've got to just compete. You've just got to put away the data and compete. But I found the data incredibly helpful. But then there was a time in which I had to get in there and just get it done. I had to rely on my feeling. And that's my question is, where does feeling come into play versus the data, and how do you navigate those?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, humans, our brains are not at all built to process data or statistics or anything like that. Our brains are just really lousy. That's why we have these artificial intelligences and things like calculators and statistics programs. So the real challenge in quantified self is actually finding meaning in all this data. So it's actually not that hard to generate the data, to collect it, to store it, but to extract meaning from it, particularly in real time, as you were trying to do in a race, is very, very, very difficult and challenging. However, there are some kind of interesting things about it. And one aspect of where you want to go with this is we don't actually, again, want to have data. We want to turn that data into a new sense, into a sensory thing. You want to be able to, as you say, to feel it rather than to have to see all these data. You want to kind of know it in your body. And so I think I talked about in the book this really cool hack this guy did of a digital compass. He turned it into a belt so you could feel north rather than just see it. And so it became a new sense. He invented a new sense. He was sensitive to northness, to the cardinal directions, and he had an intuitive sense of where north was. He could just point to it, but that actually transferred into almost a better kind of intuitive sense of a map of where he was geographically, because he always knew where exactly north was. And so he got a new sensation of spatial navigation. And so there's experiments with people, I know a guy who's doing a vest so you could turn sight into a feelings for blind people, so they could actually feel where they were. They have a camera that's looking, and they feel in their chest. And so this sense, this ability to take a lot amount of data and turn it into a new sense, so you actually want to be able to feel your glucose in your blood, or you'll be able to feel them rather than just have to look at data. So I think the data is just the first step. Yep. The second step is actually to make new senses out of it, and that's where we're going with that. And then the third one would be kind of to do it in real time, and then to learn how to absorb a new sense and to master a new sense. And so I think you're right that we're kind of just in early stages, and we're dealing with numbers, which we're really terrible at dealing with.
No, I love your answer. It's fantastic. And it was a great fun chapter to read. I know we've got to get wrapped up here quickly, and I wanted to just ask one last question that was related to really people playing offense within their life and within business as it relates to the technologies you talk about. You talk about augmented reality, virtual reality, sharing. You talked about a lot of different concepts throughout the book, but if someone wanted to have an idea and they wanted to take action on it, but they didn't have the team in place, so they knew the direction, but they just needed to supplement experts. Would you be inclined to look at crowdfunding? Would you be inclined to look at like Elance platforms or places where you can find experts? How would you counsel someone to go through like the first 3 steps of getting access to a team of experts that you weren't necessarily going to bring them on as employees?
Of course, Elance has changed their name, or I think they're called
Upwork
now.
Yeah.
I've used them a lot. They're very, very good for this kind of prototyping, the speed. Don't think of them necessarily as cheaper. Think of them as faster.
Sure.
And temporary, so you can actually prototype. So yes, I think that's a wonderful tool of being able to outsource freelancers. And the challenge there is specifying what you want done. If you don't know what you want done, that kind of outsourcing is not really useful. I mean, you can do experiments, but you have to be able to specify the task. And if you can do that, you can outsource very, very, very fast. I think it kind of depends. I know there are a lot of creative people who host, they call workshops, kind of prototyping workshops, where they bring together friends or whatever, people that they know of different skills, and they're coming together for a day, and they have pizza and they're doing something, and this is just to try something out. Not knowing more specific what you have in mind, I don't know, but there's certainly a number of different ways to do this. And the thing that I adhere to is the IDEO, which is a design company. They call it the design approach to life. The basic premise there is that you don't think about things, you do things, that you learn more by doing very, very rapid prototyping, like within hours. Instead of trying to think your way through, you do, and that you learn much more by doing first before thinking. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it just says, okay, you try something fast, and that will tell you more, and then you can think on that and then do another thing, and so that you are prototyping from the very, very beginning, and that's a better way to think about problems than it is to think about them.
Prototyping from the beginning. It sounds like my son in the paintball game this weekend, where he just kept on shooting and shooting until he found me and hit me square in the head.
Exactly. Yeah, right. But no, I mean, it's like if you're going to invent a paintball machine, the idea is like you're not sitting down doing sketch after sketch. You're going to go into the workshop and you make something just to prototype to see if it at all can work. And you go from prototype to prototype. It's not that you don't do thinking, but you do it after you've done some prototypes. And that's true about whatever scale you're talking about. You can fake things too. I mean, in the prototyping, the whole thing about prototyping is that you can often do things manually, and then you can automate them later, but you do it manually to see if it even works or if anybody wants it or whatever. So the prototyping doesn't mean that it always has to be a mechanical gizmo. It just means that you are doing something.
Well, Kevin, I want to thank you for your time, your wisdom, and your ceaseless creation of books, and it's been fascinating. And I love your new book, The Inevitable, and I highly recommend it. Is there a way that people can reach out, read more of your materials, or a preferred website, Twitter, or such that you would prefer people to reach out to learn more about you?
Yeah, I have a pretty big, extensive website at my initials, kk.org, kk.org. And there's a book page for the book with all the translations for those who want other languages, and my other books as well, and my blogs, of which there are many, including Cool Tools, which is this place we review one recommended tool a weekday.
Cool Tools is fascinating, and that book was fantastic.
Right. Well, thank you. There's a best of Cool Tools book, which is aimed at young people to show them the incredible possibilities that they have of doing stuff themselves to make things happen. And then I have a silver cord graphic novel. We have a collection of long-term forecasts for the future. Anyway, so all that's at kk.org. And I'm kind of active a little bit on Twitter, which is Kevin2Kelly, the number 2, Kevin number 2 Kelly. I know a lot of Kevin Kelly, so I'm Kevin2Kelly.
Kevin2Kelly.
And yeah, so that's...
We'll link this up in the show notes. And are you active on Google Hangouts as well, did I hear?
Yes, I am. I do post, and actually I do a lot of reading. I have people that I follow that I find very interesting. I think Google.com is a little bit much more long form and intellectual. It works for me in terms of discussing and hearing about kind of technological developments. So I do post some tips and, articles and links and stuff on Google+. And I'm Kevin Kelly or Kevin2Kelly there as well.
Well, Kevin, I very much appreciate your time today and the message you've given to our listeners.
Well, it's really been a pleasure discussing everything with you, Bill, and I appreciate the attention and enthusiasm for my book.
Thanks, Kevin, and have a great rest of the day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
So there you have it. That was Kevin Kelly. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with him. I was really excited to bring him onto the show, and I hope the enthusiasm that we both generated together talking about these important concepts came through. You'll find the show notes for this episode at redzonetech.net/podcast. You'll also be able to download the transcript as well. If you're looking for enterprise virtual CISO services on demand, if you are a CIO or a CISO looking for a way to bolster your IT security program or obtain a virtual backstop that you can engage at a tactical and strategic level regarding information security, go to redzonetech.net to learn more. Again, that's redzonetech.net. Until next time, I'm Bill Murphy and I'm signing off. Thank you for listening and have a great day. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.